Hello, my name is Ambalawanar Ken Kandeepan. I am a chartered professional accountant and a chartered financial analyst. I am 67 years old and I retired 1 year ago. Prior to my retirement, I was the Chief Financial Officer and the Chief Risk Officer of the Ontario Financing Authority, which is a provincial government agency responsible for the borrowing and debt management for the province. So I had an excellent career in Canada. So I'd like to talk a little bit about our experiences in BlackJuly, which was an extremely traumatic and unforgettable in the most unpleasant sense of the word for both my wife and myself. My wife and I at the time were engaged. We were in our 20s. We had just got engaged in June. And then in July, we heard the news that there were some problems as a result of the bodies of the 13 soldiers being brought to the cemetery in Kandeepan. So I joined my wife, who lived with her uncle and aunt in a place called Ratmalana, which is in the suburbs of Colombo, and which is a heavy Sinhalese area, decided that living in that house was not safe. And they came over to their uncle's house. Their uncle was a fairly famous orthopedic surgeon called Dr. Parameshwaran, who had a house in Havelock Road. And so they came to that house and they called me to come and join them. I was living with a group of other accountants in another house. So I joined them. At that time, actually, not only my wife and her uncle and aunt were actually living in the house in Ratmalana, and we decided to go and pick them up. Yes, that's the chronology. So we went and picked them up in the morning. And when we were driving back to our uncle's house in Havelock Park, or my wife's uncle's house in Havelock, we could see smoke all over the city. And that was really worrying. We came to his house in Havelock Park, and that evening, the neighbors called my wife's uncle and said that their house in Ratmalana had been completely burnt. So the whole family was in tears. This was my wife, her uncle, her aunt, and their 2 children. All of their belongings had been lost. And then, to add insult to injury, in the next morning, because, as I said, my wife's uncle was a fairly well-known surgeon, some people whom he knew called him and said that there were groups of Sinhalese mobs which were actively hunting his house. So we got really scared, and every time there was a noise on the street outside, we basically ran to a half-constructed house which was next door and simply hid there. Fortunately, nobody came. And that night, we heard what was supposed to be really reliable information that my uncle's house was going to be burnt, or my wife's uncle's house was going to be burnt. And what happened was, the house opposite was a judge, a Sinhalese judge, and his son came over and said, "Why don't you all come and stay at our house?" And we all went there. He was a man very committed to law and order, and he did not think that any of these were appropriate. So, and he had a few guns with him as well. So he had one gun, and because I knew how to shoot, he gave me a gun as well, and a box of shells. And I sat outside on the steps the whole night for 2 nights, holding this gun with my wife, or my fiancée at the time, by my side. We were utterly scared. And his instructions were, if the mob comes, shoot. And he said, you shoot a couple of those guys and the rest will run away. Well, God knows whether that'll happen or not. But we stayed there for 2 nights, and it was 2 of the most traumatic and scary nights that my wife and I have experienced in our lives. After that, what happened was, because my uncle, as I said, was a very well-connected surgeon, he was able to book a passage to us in one of the Indian boats, which was then going from Colombo to Jaffna on a regular basis. And my wife, myself, and my wife's little cousin, who at that time was 10 or 11 years old, and she's in the US, she's in Canada as well, and she's done very well here too. We all went in that boat to Jaffna. and we stayed there for a couple of months. The trauma of this, I think my wife was more traumatized than I was. I remember even for the first 5 to 10 years in Canada, whenever she sees an army truck, I mean, this is the Canadian army truck, she would get very scared. I mean, even though her head tells her this is the Canadian army, or when we drive to the US and you see a US army truck, her head tells her that this is a US army or a Canadian army and absolutely safe. Her heart tells her that this is dangerous, and she would get extremely scared. We have gone back to Sri Lanka a couple of times after that, and in both instances, everything would scare her. So much so that, this has been an intensely traumatic experience for her and for me as well. And we were only happy that our daughter was not born at that time, and she was born in Canada in a very safe country. So one other thing I'd like to say from my perspective as somebody who has lived in Canada for 40 years is, when you look at it from the perspective, the Canadian perspective, we understand some elements of the majority community or the Sinhalese rioting. But what we find inconceivable is how the police and the armed forces either stood by or encouraged the rioters, or in a number of instances, they participated in the riots. We find that inconceivable, and it's so sad to see that in the last 40 years, nothing has improved in Sri Lanka. The same situation is still there. In other words, law and order is actually something which is on paper, but which is not observed. So just to finish our story, after going to Jaffna and living there for 2 or 3 months, we all came back. I mean, we had to work, we had to earn a living. So we came back to Colombo. And because I was a chartered accountant, and so was my wife is an accountant as well, although at that time she was only partly qualified, she was going through her accounting program. We applied for jobs outside. I received an offer to go to Zambia, another offer to go to Bahrain. And then my wife's uncle, who came here in the 70s, and he himself was an accountant, and he was married to actually a family physician, a doctor. And so they had a fairly substantial household income. He decided to sponsor the entire family there. And the Canadian government had a program where if you had an uncle, aunt, even a first cousin who was here and who was financially stable, and if you could prove that you had been affected in the riots, they actually processed you very quickly. So my wife and I, out of our family, out of my wife's family, my wife and I were the first 2 people who applied. And the Canadian embassy processed our visa, and we were actually here within 6 months. So in July of 1984, we landed in Canada, and we have had a pretty good life. And because of this program, my wife's entire family came here as well. That was our Black July story. And like I said, 40 years later, I still remember the burning. I still remember the noise. I still remember the mobs. I still remember the stories that we heard about the people whom we know who were burnt alive, who were pulled out of buses, and who were murdered, or who were cut to pieces, etc. All of that, even after 40 years, is fresh in our collective memory.